Ime Udoka will not be the next head coach of the Brooklyn Nets. The team is ending its pursuit of the Celtics, former Celtics head coach today. We, of course, got this piece of news that the Nets have instead hired Jacque Vaughn as their head coach, taking the interim tag off his title. This comes after last week's reports that Brooklyn was moving towards hiring Udoka to replace Steve Nash. On Sunday, however, Mark Stein reported that Nets owner Joe Tsai was being strongly urged to abandon the team's intent to hire Udoka to replace Steve Nash. All right, this is what we're deep diving today. We got Chris Forsberg and Tom Giles in studio. Guys, the longer this dragged on, the more I started thinking, this probably isn't going to happen. I don't know why. I mean, this is like there's still more questions there's more questions than answers. But in your opinion, Chris, why do you think the Nets abandoned ship?
I mean, you saw what kind of week the Nets had last week, right?
Rough one, rough.
Yeah, it wasn't great, and Kyrie compounded matters at every turn. And so I do think there was just almost like when you screen a movie, and they've got the public pulse on it, and they said, ugh.
Rotten Tomatoes.
Yeah, Rotten Tomatoes hated that movie, and unfortunately, I just think it did. Perception became something they had to consider, and maybe if they were a little bit more willing to just kind of like, we weren't there, we don't know what Ime, and could have got away with it, plausible deniability. At some point, they probably had to shift and be like, no, this is something we can't continue to allow to fester around our culture, and so they've made the decision to go in a simpler route.
It's possible that they did more vetting and, didn't think it was the right fit based on, for whatever reason, Ime Udoka was suspended for the year from the Celtics. But I think this comes back to Kyrie Irving. I really do. I think that once the Nets decide that we're going to suspend Kyrie Irving for 5 games and they're sending down a suspension from the team in that situation, how do you then go ahead and hire a coach who was suspended for a year by another team and say, all right, you can come in and start coaching right away? I mean, I feel like that didn't exactly line up, especially with all the stuff going on with Kyrie.
But let's make no mistake, they were gonna do it. They reached out, they had the ball rolling. It just, I think again, if we're left connecting the dots from the outside, it sure feels like they were trying to get away from the public scorn that was coming up.
And that's why I wonder too, like at some point when they talked that they were urged not to, how much did the NBA play a role? Did the NBA quietly step in and say, Nets, you are not doing this? Well, to get the perspective from Brooklyn, Ian Begley from SNY, that's Sportsnet New York, is joining us. He covers the Brooklyn Nets. Ian, from your vantage point, you cover the Nets day in and day out. Why did this fall apart?
I think as the days passed by and negative stories, negative headlines continued to swirl around the Nets, whether it was regarding Kyrie Irving or the public reaction to the potential hiring of Ime Udoka, there was blowback internally, externally around this Nets organization about hiring Udoka, considering everything that had gone on with Udoka. Obviously, the Celtics deciding that whatever had happened was severe enough that they did not want him coaching their team this season. I think there was so much talk, again, outside and inside with the Nets that they decided that they just had to go with the safe choice in Jacque Vaughn.
Ian, do you think that at any point, I actually read this in your reporting, did Ime Udoka not want the job? Did he have a say in it?
I think that he had some concerns, again, as things went along here and we got further and further from Steve Nash's firing and the negative headlines continued around the Nets, the speculation and the blowback about them potentially hiring Ime Udoka and the situation with Kyrie Irving. I got the sense that on Udoka's side, there was some hesitancy. There was an idea that, hey, this is probably not the best opportunity for us to go right now into this storm and try to get it sorted out. Maybe there's going to be better opportunities for Udoka in the future. I assume there will be, but I think there was some hesitancy as we got closer to today's decision that, hey, this is going to be a tricky situation for us to come into because of everything that's going on in Brooklyn.
Chris, when it first came out that the hiring was imminent, you said, you know what, this might be the best thing for the Celtics. They can just rip this Band-Aid off and move on. Well, now that Band-Aid is back on. Where does the team go from here?
Yeah, it's fascinating to me. I'll be interested to hear the player reaction tonight because we already heard like 2 players, Marcus Smart and Jaylen Brown, came out in the immediate aftermath at that shoot-around on the road and addressed it and sort of expressed their frustration with the fact that he might not be back. And now you've got to, like, whether it's, I keep calling it like ripping the Band-Aid, right? Like, as hard as it would have been, you rip it, you see them in December. Then maybe you start to move on finally. And now it feels like now they're going to have to react to this. And now every NBA coaching opening from here is going to be, okay, is Ime going to be up for that job? And we're going to be asking them about it. On the one hand, it erases the whole he's going to an Eastern Conference rival, and maybe that's a little bit more digestible. But just in general, Giles, it feels like it's going to linger for much longer than we thought.
But the other side of this is that when this story first came out last week, there were a lot of people around here and around Boston saying, well, what could he have possibly done if the Nets are, ready to hire him just less than 10 games into the season? So I still think maybe there's the possibility that the Nets looked at it and said no. And I think a lot of people just sat there and said, did the Celtics do the wrong thing in suspending him if someone else is willing to take him on and coach within 10 games? And now maybe you look back and say no.
Yeah, Ian, in your reporting, what do you know about the Nets vetting process of Ime Udoka, what they found out? Or is it less about Ime Udoka and more about just not wanting to have another guy with baggage when you've got all this stuff going on with Kyrie Irving?
My assumption is that it wasn't necessarily about anything that they found out over the past few days, and it was more so about the idea that bringing a coach in Ime Udoka's situation into this situation, which already had uncertainty, volatility off the court, on the court, it just wasn't a decision that the Nets felt they could make. I don't think that they uncovered anything new. I think that going into letting Steve Nash go, they had already done some due diligence. I think there was additional due diligence in the days after, but I have to think it was more so about the idea that you're bringing a coach with Ime Udoka's most recent baggage or situation into this situation where it's unstable, so they opted for stability here with Jacque Vaughn. The interesting thing that Sean Marks said earlier tonight was that Kevin Durant did not have a say in this decision. It was Sean Marks' call. Marks said he wants Kevin Durant to focus on basketball and do what he loves. He did not want to impose this on Durant, but Durant obviously had a lot of say in the decision making about this team in previous seasons, so just an interesting juxtaposition there.
You heard Forsberg talk about how now every time there's a job opening, Ime Udoka's name is going to come up. Can you see Ime Udoka still going to another team, maybe even as soon as this year, or will it probably, do you think it'll take until the off season?
I think it could happen this year. I mean, it depends on if it's a team in the Nets situation where, hey, they know they have to win games immediately to fulfill their goals, given who's on the roster, the salaries of the players that are on the roster. If a team is in a win-now mode and needs to shore things up defensively and wants somebody who's going to come in and hold players accountable, I'm sure they're going to heavily consider Ime Udoka. So it just depends on who makes that in-season firing and what they want to do. But I assume Ime Udoka, if he doesn't get hired this season, he's going to get hired within the next few months, this coming off season, just because of the talent that he is as a head coach. I think some franchise is going to be comfortable with giving him another chance.
Chris, we see what Brooklyn decided to do. They ripped that interim tag right off of Jacque Vaughn. Should the Celtics do the same with Joe Mazzulla? Because obviously this even being in play says to all of us that Ime Udoka is not coming back to coach the Boston Celtics. It may have seemed like that based on the comments that Marcus Smart made last week, that maybe they were led to believe this really was just a suspension. But I think we all know now Ime Udoka is done in Boston. So why not just give Joe Mazzulla the title?
My only question would be, can you, I don't, legally is not the right word, but with this, him being suspended, can you do that? Can you technically take the tag off? Ime, until there's a resolution, is probably the head coach of this team, just the suspended version. But I do think it maybe makes you a little bit more eager, if you were trying to move on from this, to get to that resolution point and then address what you want to do with Joe. And credit to Joe, because he's handled this. It's already a tough situation to be thrown into, and now to have this continue to hover, he's the one I feel bad for in this situation. And luckily for the Celtics, interim or not, he's going to coach his butt off and try to get this thing right.